Sheriff Mark Collins believed Pine Ridge was his town. He controlled businesses, intimidated families, and ruled through fear. No one ever stood up to him. Until one Sunday morning at a small diner, he kicked a German shepherd lying quietly under a table, just to remind everyone who was in charge. What Collins didn't know was that the silent man sitting there wasn't afraid of badges or threats. He was a former Navy SEAL, and that single moment would expose everything Collins had spent years hiding. Before we begin, please help me reach my first 1,000 subscribers. Your single click truly means more than you know. God bless you for keeping hope alive. A pale morning cold lingered over Pine Ridge, Idaho, the kind that crept into bones without wind or warning, wrapping the small mountain town in silence and thin silver light. The mountains stood unmoving in the distance, their shadows long and quiet, as if the town itself had learned to stay small, still, and unnoticed. It was the kind of cold that didn't rush or bite, but waited patiently, settling into cracks and corners, the same way secrets did in places like this. Ethan Walker drove his aging forest green pickup through the center of town at a steady, unhurried pace, hands resting loosely on the wheel, as if the truck were an extension of his body rather than a machine. The paint was faded and scarred with shallow scratches earned on dirt roads and forgotten trails. Nothing polished, nothing that invited a second look. At 35, Ethan was tall without being imposing, lean and compact, built for endurance rather than display. His angular face carried a short, neatly kept beard threaded with early gray, his hair cut close in quiet military restraint. His steel blue eyes moved constantly, never lingering, always measuring distance, exits, and people. He hadn't planned to stop in Pine Ridge. He rarely planned beyond the next hour anymore. The road had become both shelter and escape after years of service that trained his mind to expect danger even in sleep. But hunger and fatigue nudged him off the highway toward a diner whose sun-faded sign looked like it survived on stubbornness alone. Inside the Pine Ridge Diner, the air smelled of reheated coffee, fried eggs, and old wood soaked with decades of routine and repetition. Ethan slid into a corner booth without hesitation, his back to the wall, shoulders angled so he could see the front door and the narrow hallway leading to the kitchen. It was instinct, not paranoia, shaped by rooms far more hostile than this one. Beneath the table, shadow settled with disciplined precision. The German shepherd was nearly 7, broad-chested and powerful, his thick black and tan coat catching the dull light. His movements were economical, his posture calm but alert, amber eyes never fully closing. Shadow understood that stillness was not the absence of readiness, but its most refined form, and he remained motionless, a quiet presence anchoring the space around him. Mary Thompson approached with the careful gait of someone whose body had learned to endure rather than complain. 60 years old and widowed, she carried herself with quiet resilience, her silver hair pulled into a low bun that never stayed neat for long. Years of work had narrowed her shoulders and roughened her hands, her fair skin weathered by time and responsibility. Yet her hazel eyes remained warm, carrying an almost maternal attentiveness. She poured Ethan's coffee gently, her movements practiced and unhurried, pausing briefly when she noticed shadow beneath the table. A soft smile touched her lips, the kind born from admiration rather than surprise, and she spoke with a voice worn thin but steady, as if kindness had long outlasted hope. Behind the counter, 14-year-old Lucas scrubbed plates with a focus that bordered on desperation. Thin to the point of fragility, he moved with restless energy, shoulders tense, as though he had learned early that being useful meant being safe. His brown hair fell into his eyes no matter how often he cut it, and his pale skin carried the look of someone who spent more time indoors than outside. Each time the bell above the door rattled, his gaze flicked up instinctively, eyes sharp with worry. Lucas dreamed of leaving Pine Ridge one day, of learning a trade or finding a place where his name meant more than "that kid from the diner." But for now he stayed, anchored by responsibility, fear, and a town that noticed boys like him only when something went wrong. The morning drifted by with deceptive ease. Locals came and went quietly, exchanging muted greetings, avoiding eye contact longer than necessary. Forks clinked against plates, coffee cups were refilled, and the world seemed almost gentle. Shadow remained motionless beneath the table, grounding the space with his presence. Ethan sipped his coffee slowly without tasting it, memories brushing the edges of his mind. Desert heat, the weight of gear on his shoulders, the distant thump of rotors, the cost of vigilance that never truly shut off. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe this stop would be uneventful, just another pause before the road reclaimed him. Then the front door flew open. The brass bell shrieked sharply, slicing through the diner's calm like a blade. Conversations died mid-sentence. Mary froze with the coffee pot still in her hand. Lucas stiffened at the sink, knuckles whitening against the edge. Ethan's eyes lifted instantly, locking onto the doorway, and Shadow's ears snapped upright as his body coiled, controlled, silent, ready. Someone had just walked in who did not belong to the peace of that room. Mark Collins entered the Pine Ridge Diner like a man stepping into a room he believed already belonged to him. In his late 40s, thick-necked and heavy through the shoulders, his sheriff's uniform stretched tight across a body that had once relied on strength and now relied on authority. His hair was cropped short and graying at the temples, his broad, ruddy face marked by a permanent flush that made his pale blue eyes seem colder than they were. A carefully trimmed mustache sat above his lip, as if order in small things could somehow balance the disorder he left behind. Collins didn't scan the room for threats. He scanned it for submission. 2 deputies followed in practiced lockstep. Deputy Alan Price was tall and narrow, early 30s, sharp-nosed with restless eyes that avoided confrontation unless numbers were on his side. Deputy Rick Harlow was the opposite, broad, slow-moving, shaved head, his vacant expression belonging to a man who followed orders because thinking required effort. The bell above the door had barely stopped ringing before the air inside the diner tightened, like a muscle bracing for impact. They did not greet anyone or glance at a menu. Collins claimed the central booth without asking, sprawling sideways with his arm draped across the backrest in a posture meant to be seen and felt. Price laughed too loudly at nothing, while Harlow leaned against the counter, blocking space by his sheer presence. Mary's smile faltered for the briefest moment before she masked it, turning back to the coffee machine with practiced calm. Behind the counter, Lucas stiffened, his hands wet and shaking, eyes locked on the sink as if looking up might invite attention. In the corner booth, Ethan remained still, posture unchanged, but his awareness sharpened. He noticed how the deputies positioned themselves, how the room seemed to shrink, how fear moved faster than sound. Collins rose suddenly, carrying a cup of coffee he hadn't paid for, and strolled down the narrow aisle with exaggerated carelessness. When he reached Ethan's table, he kicked the leg of the booth hard enough to jolt it. The cup tilted, dark liquid splashing across the floor, steam rising as it spread inches from Shadow's paws. "Careful there," Collins said with a crooked grin, his voice loud and mocking. "Wouldn't want a dangerous animal getting startled." Shadow flinched once, a reflex quickly mastered, pulling his paws back without a sound. He did not growl. He did not move. Ethan did not stand. He simply lifted his eyes to meet Collins, offering neither defiance nor fear, only a flat, measuring look that lasted a second too long. Collins felt it without understanding why. His smile tightened before he turned away, irritation flickering beneath the confidence. The tension snapped at the counter. Lucas's hand slipped, a metal tray clattering as spoons spilled onto the tile, the sound echoing too loudly in the sudden quiet. Collins pivoted instantly, crossing the space in 3 long strides. He grabbed Lucas by the collar, yanking the boy forward until their faces were inches apart. Lucas smelled cheap aftershave and stale coffee, his breath shallow, his eyes wide with panic. "You useless?" Collins asked softly, the way men speak when they want an audience. "Because I can fix that. Juvenile detention does wonders for boys who don't learn." Price smirked. Harlow watched without expression. Mary froze, one hand clutching a dish towel. From the corner booth, Ethan felt his jaw tighten imperceptibly as something old stirred in his chest, the memory of smaller bodies under bigger boots, power mistaken for law. "Enough," Mary said, her voice thin but steady. Collins glanced at her, surprised, then amused. He released Lucas with a shove that sent the boy stumbling back into the counter. "Clean it up," he said, nodding toward the scattered spoons. "And keep your hands steady. Accidents make people suspicious." Lucas dropped to his knees, fingers trembling as he gathered the utensils, tears burning but unfallen. Ethan's gaze never left Collins. He catalogued details, the badge number, the way the deputies deferred, the ease with which cruelty was delivered. This wasn't impulse. This was habit. Collins returned to his booth and resumed his seat as if nothing had happened. Forced laughter followed, brittle and hollow. Slowly, the diner's noise crept back, but the warmth was gone, replaced by something sour and watchful. Ethan reached down briefly, resting his fingertips against Shadow's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath his fur. Shadow remained calm, but his eyes tracked every movement now. Ethan took another sip of coffee, letting the bitterness ground him. He had come to Pine Ridge by chance. He stayed now by choice, not out of anger, but recognition. He had seen this pattern before: authority unchecked, fear normalized, cruelty disguised as order. When Collins finally stood to leave, he paused near the door and glanced back toward Ethan's table. "Leash your dog," he said casually. "Town has rules." Ethan met his gaze in silence. Collins scoffed and turned away, convinced the moment belonged to him. The bell rang as the deputies followed him out, the sound lingering longer than before. Outside, the cruiser engine started and faded into the distance. Inside, no one spoke for several seconds. Ethan exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing. He knew, with a certainty sharpened by years of experience, that this was not the last time their paths would cross. The afternoon light over Pine Ridge flattened the town into a single dull tone, draining contrast from buildings and faces alike. Ethan sat on a bench outside the diner, coffee long finished, Shadow resting at his feet, when Frank Miller approached with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned not to waste motion. At 78, Frank was lean to the point of brittleness, his posture bent but not broken, as if discipline still held his spine together. His thin white hair was cut short, his face carved deep with years of sun and salt. One eye sat slightly lower from an old injury, his hands trembling faintly on his cane, yet his gaze remained sharp, steady, unafraid. Frank sat beside Ethan without ceremony, nodding toward the empty street. He did not ask whether Ethan had noticed Collins. He assumed it. "A town like this," he said quietly, "doesn't stay quiet by accident." Ethan listened the way he had once listened to briefings that decided who lived and who didn't. Frank explained that Mark Collins was the mayor's brother-in-law, a truth known to everyone and challenged by no one. The police answered to Collins, the council to the mayor, and paperwork to whoever touched it last. Businesses were fined until they complied or sold cheap. Teenagers were corrected early. Complaints vanished. People who pushed too hard found reasons to leave. Frank spoke without bitterness, only exhaustion, recalling how his own report years ago had been logged, misfiled, and erased. Inside the diner, Mary wiped the same section of counter again and again, her movements mechanical. When Ethan returned to settle his bill, she met his eyes briefly, then looked away. Later, when the room was empty enough to breathe, she told him the truth. The health department notice taped behind the register wasn't real, not the way it claimed to be. The violations were vague, the deadlines impossible, the fines designed to climb. A stranger who knew her numbers too well had offered a solution: sell the diner cheap and walk away clean. Mary's shoulders tightened as she spoke, her face lined not with fear, but endurance. "I raised my kids here," she said. "This place kept me standing." As dusk approached, Pine Ridge grew quieter, though not calmer. Frank walked home in measured steps, pausing once to rest. Mary locked the diner early. Lucas lingered in the doorway, eyes tracking a patrol car that rolled by too slowly. Ethan watched the town fold inward, windows dimming, voices retreating behind walls. He felt the familiar pull to leave, the habit of motion that had kept him intact for years. Staying was never easy. Staying meant attention. Staying meant consequences. Ethan weighed the choice without anger or urgency. What he felt instead was recognition, the alignment of a pattern he had seen before, places where power hardened because no one was allowed to test it. Pine Ridge wasn't unique, it was practiced, and practice made systems efficient. Night fell quickly in the mountains. Ethan loaded Shadow into the truck and drove past the last streetlight, past the welcome sign whose paint had faded with neglect. He didn't head for the highway. He turned onto a logging road, driving until the town lights vanished behind trees. The forest swallowed sound and distance, needles crunching beneath tires, the air cooling with each mile. He stopped in a small clearing, trees close enough to feel like walls. Shadow jumped down, circled once, then stood still, ears pivoting, reading the dark. Ethan set a small camp with practiced efficiency, nothing wasted. As he worked, he thought of Frank's jacket, Mary's hands, Lucas's eyes. He thought of Collins's smile and how it had tightened when it met something it couldn't name. Ethan didn't make promises, not to himself, not to anyone. But as he sat on the tailgate, resting a hand on Shadow's neck, he understood the decision already made. Pine Ridge hadn't asked for help. It had been trained not to. That didn't change what it needed. The town had sewn its mouth shut to survive, and Ethan intended to learn where the stitches were. City forest north of Pine Ridge breathed differently at night, thick with resin and damp earth, the pines standing close enough to turn darkness into a room with no corners. Ethan set his temporary camp where the ground dipped and the trees broke the wind, choosing concealment over comfort. The traveler vanished here, replaced by the soldier. His movements became spare and deliberate, shaped by years when sleep came in fragments and days were measured by tasks completed. Shadow adapted without command, posture sharpening, senses widening, his presence steady as a heartbeat. When Ethan finished, there was no trace of them beyond a scuffed patch of needles and a memory the forest would keep. At dawn, Ethan fitted Shadow with a harness that looked ordinary to anyone who didn't know better. Dark nylon, low-profile buckles, nothing reflective. He clipped a microcamera beneath the chest strap, no larger than a matchbox, matte black and silent, designed to disappear against fur. Shadow stood still while Ethan worked, amber eyes calm, ears tracking the woods. Nearly 7 years old, Shadow's thick coat and dense muscle hid a temperament disciplined to serenity. He had learned that work meant patience first, speed second. Ethan tested the feed on a small tablet, the image steady, the audio clean. "Easy roots," he murmured, and Shadow's tail flicked once in acknowledgement. The days settled into a rhythm. Ethan watched from distance and shadow, from parked angles that looked accidental, and from tree lines that felt inevitable. He logged patrol patterns, times, faces. A cruiser stopped a rental SUV just past the welcome sign. The officer leaned in, smiling, voice low. A wallet appeared. Cash changed hands. The car left with its headlights shaking. Another afternoon, behind a closed lumber yard, men met beneath a corrugated awning while rain stitched dust into mud. The exchange was quick. Envelopes, nods, a shared joke that never reached the eyes. Shadow's camera caught it all. Half-lit faces, sap and oil-stained hands, a badge glinting once before turning away. There were no receipts, no radios crackling reports, only routine. Collins appeared in these scenes like gravity, felt even when he wasn't present. When he was, the air tightened. He stood close, spoke softly, let others do the rough edges. Cash went into his jacket pocket without counting. The men around him watched his hands more than his eyes. Ethan didn't need names yet. He needed patterns, confirmations, repetition strong enough to survive denial. He marked timestamps and routes, saved redundancies, mirrored files. The evidence grew heavy, not with spectacle, but with certainty. Inside town, another pressure built. Lucas's route changed, his shoulders sinking lower each day, eyes scanning corners he used to ignore. Ethan noticed him outside the diner one evening, whispering tensely with Deputy Alan Price. Price's posture was casual, predatory, his smile thin. Lucas nodded too quickly, hands clenched, then bolted. Later, Lucas told Ethan the truth in fragments, voice breaking. He had been ordered to listen, to notice who came and went, to repeat conversations that weren't his. "Just keeping the town safe," Price had said. 14 years old, all elbows and nerves, hair falling into his eyes, Lucas hated it and was good at it. Both facts frightened him. Ethan offered no heroics. He asked questions and listened, the way he had learned to listen to men standing unknowingly on fault lines. He told Lucas only this: don't change your routine. Don't take risks. Remember details and nothing more. Lucas nodded, swallowing hard, relief and dread tangling together. When Ethan left, the boy sat alone on the diner's back steps, counting breaths until the sound of a cruiser faded. By the fourth night, the data set was complete enough to end careers and precise enough to survive cross-examination. Ethan reviewed it beneath the trees, tablet glow dimmed, shadow pressed against his leg. He could act now, pull threads and watch the cloth tear, but he didn't. He thought of Mary's hands shaking once before steadying, of Frank's jacket patched with care, of Lucas's fear turning inward. A premature strike would scatter them and drive the rot deeper. Rain stitched the night together as Ethan packed down his camp, leaving nothing but pressed needles and silence. The evidence was enough. The truth was ready. All that remained was timing, the kind that couldn't be rushed and couldn't be missed. Somewhere in Pine Ridge, a public moment was approaching, and when it arrived, there would be nowhere left to hide. Sunday morning poured into Pine Ridge Diner with a brightness that felt almost defiant. Sunlight slanted through the front windows, catching dust motes and turning them into drifting sparks above crowded booths. Families filled the room shoulder to shoulder, voices overlapping, cutlery clinking, the air thick with bacon grease and syrup. Ethan Walker stepped inside with Shadow at his side, his posture relaxed but precise, the way a blade rests in its sheath. He did not pause to scan the room. He already knew it. He walked straight to the large round table by the window, the one no one else ever used, and sat down. Shadow slipped beneath the table and settled, body aligned, eyes on the door. Mary saw him and went pale. She was carrying a pot of coffee, her hands steady by habit, but her breath caught. She hurried over, leaning in close, voice barely audible. "Ethan, honey, that table." Her eyes flicked toward the entrance. Ethan met her gaze with a small, calm smile that didn't ask permission. "It's empty," he said gently. "I'll have eggs and water for him." Mary hesitated, then nodded, torn between fear and something like relief. Around them, conversations thinned, a ripple of unease spreading outward as people noticed where Ethan had chosen to sit. The door opened exactly on time. Mark Collins entered with his 2 deputies, laughter loud and practiced, already unbuckling belts as if the meal were owed to them. Collins stopped mid-step when he saw the table. The smile slid off his face, replaced by a slow flush creeping up his neck. The diner fell into a silence so complete it seemed to press against the walls. Collins crossed the room, boots heavy on tile, baton tapping once against his palm as punctuation. "You're in my seat," he said, looming over the table, voice low and dangerous. Ethan looked up, expression neutral. "I checked," he replied evenly. "No reservation." One of the deputies, Rick Harlow, broad and dull-eyed, shifted closer, then bent and drove his boot under the table. It connected with Shadow's ribs in a sharp, cruel motion. A growl rolled out of Shadow's chest, deep and controlled, muscles coiling without breaking position. Before the deputy could react, a chair scraped back. Frank Miller stood, cane forgotten, old Marine fire cutting through his frailty. "That's enough," Frank said, voice cracked but iron hard. Harlow shoved him aside without looking. Frank hit the floor hard, breath knocked from him. Mary gasped. Someone cried out. The room shattered into noise. Ethan moved. 3 seconds was generous. His hand trapped Collins's wrist as the baton came up, torque precise, leverage clean. Ethan stepped in, turned, and used Collins's weight against him. The sheriff hit the floor face first, breath exploding out of him, arm locked in a hold that pinned bone and ego alike. The baton skittered away. The motion was so efficient it barely registered as violence, more correction than attack. Shadow stayed down, eyes locked, growl gone. The deputies froze, shock outrunning training. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Guns came out, commands collided. "Freeze! Get down!" Ethan held Collins exactly where he was, pressure calibrated, not breaking anything that didn't need breaking. He looked at the faces around him, Mary's terror, Frank's fury, Lucas frozen near the kitchen door, and made the calculation that mattered. He released the hold, stepped back, and raised his hands slowly. "I'm complying," he said, voice carrying. "I'm unarmed." He turned, placed his hands behind his back, fingers interlacing. The choice landed harder than the takedown. Collins scrambled up, red-faced, wrist clutched to his chest, barking orders that sounded thin now. Handcuffs snapped shut. Ethan didn't resist. Shadow was hauled out from under the table by another deputy, snarling restrained, eyes never leaving Ethan. The diner buzzed with stunned whispers and shaking breaths as Ethan was marched toward the door. He glanced once at Frank, who nodded back, jaw set. He met Mary's eyes. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears standing. Outside, sirens wailed closer, louder. Ethan stepped into the light, hands bound behind him, calm intact. The stage had been set exactly where he needed it. The Pine Ridge police station felt colder than the morning air outside, a concrete chill that seeped through cinder-block walls and fluorescent light. Ethan sat cuffed to a metal ring bolted into the interrogation table, posture relaxed, breathing even, eyes fixed not on the men across from him, but on the habits of the room, the hum of the lights, the scuff marks by the door, the way sound carried down the hall. Shadow was gone from sight, taken to the rear kennels, but Ethan could still feel him there, the way a compass needle feels north. Mark Collins paced, his movements sharp with wounded pride, his thick neck flushed, his jaw clenched beneath the trimmed mustache that twitched when he spoke. He believed the room belonged to him again. Collins dismissed procedure with a flick of his hand. He reached up and covered the camera lens with his cap, then flipped the breaker. The red light died. The air changed. His voice dropped into something intimate and cruel. He leaned in, close enough for Ethan to smell coffee and antiseptic. "No witnesses," Collins said. "No heroes." He talked about consequences, about animals and accidents, about how towns forget strangers. His deputies hovered near the door, Alan Price thin and restless, Rick Harlow broad and unreadable, watching Collins's hands for cues. Ethan listened without reaction, storing cadence and phrasing, letting Collins spend the confidence he thought he had earned. Ethan waited until the threats settled into repetition. Then he spoke, calm as if correcting a map. "You turned off the room camera," he said. "You forgot the one on my dog." Collins froze. The smallest pause betrayed him. Ethan continued, measured. The micro camera had been streaming for days. Timestamps, faces, exchanges, backed up redundantly, transmitted off-site. The diner, the lumber yard, the traffic stops. The words in this room just now. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He named agencies without bravado, described protocols without boasting. Collins's confidence drained by degrees, his eyes darting once to the dark lens, then away. The door opened hard. Boots flooded the room. Captain Laura Hernandez of the State Police entered first, mid-40s, tall and athletic, hair pulled into a tight bun, expression set to professional severity. Years in internal affairs had given her a posture that didn't ask permission. Behind her came two federal agents, Special Agent Marcus Reed, lean, clean-shaven, eyes like glass, and Agent Naomi Park, compact and precise, her dark hair cropped short, a tablet already in her hands. Their presence changed gravity. Hernandez ordered the cuffs off Ethan before acknowledging Collins at all. Reed nodded once, already listening to audio through an earpiece. Park's fingers moved, confirming hashes and timestamps. Collins tried to speak. Hernandez didn't let him. She read charges with the flat clarity of someone who had done this before, her voice cutting through the room like a seal. Reed stepped in, turning Collins around, cuffs clicking with a finality that sounded different from the ones used on Ethan. Price wilted. Harlow stared at the floor. Park lifted her eyes long enough to meet Ethan's and gave a small, professional nod. Down the hall, radios came alive, orders overlapping, a building waking up from a long, dishonest sleep. Outside, the afternoon light returned, brighter than it had any right to be. Ethan stood on the station steps, wrists free, shadow at his side again, fur brushed by a breeze that smelled like rain. Sirens wailed toward Town Hall. Someone mentioned warrants. Someone mentioned the mayor. Ethan didn't move. He watched the flow of uniforms and plainclothes, the way fear changed hands. Freedom wasn't a switch. It was a process, and processes took time. He needed to see the machinery engage all the way through. He walked the long way, past the diner without stopping, past boarded storefronts and the quiet houses that had learned to look away. He listened for the sounds that meant permanence, keys changing hands, locks turning, doors opening that hadn't opened in years. Shadow moved beside him, calm, attentive, the work done but not forgotten. When the courthouse lights came on early and the patrol cars stayed parked, Ethan finally exhaled. Pine Ridge wasn't healed, but the stitches had been cut. He turned back toward the road only then, satisfied enough to leave the rest to daylight. A few days later, Pine Ridge woke to a different kind of morning. The air felt lighter, not because the mountains had moved or the weather had softened, but because the town no longer carried the weight of watching itself. Storefronts opened earlier. Conversations lasted longer. People stood upright without remembering to be careful. The courthouse doors were busy, the police station quieter than it had ever been, and the patrol cars that rolled through town moved with a purpose that finally matched their paint. The Pine Ridge diner filled again, not with forced laughter, but with the honest noise of plates and plans. Mary Thompson moved behind the counter with a steadiness she hadn't felt in years. Her silver hair pinned neatly, her shoulders no longer braced for interruption. She greeted customers by name and lingered when they spoke, listening the way people do when they believe they will be heard. The health notice was gone. The phone calls had stopped. The diner belonged to her again, and it showed in the way she smiled, less careful, more real. Lucas returned to school that week. He stood taller in the hallway, backpack sitting right on his shoulders, hair cut just enough to stay out of his eyes. A counselor shook his hand and told him about a vocational scholarship, tools, training, a future that didn't require whispers. Lucas nodded, stunned, the fear that had lived in his chest loosening its grip. He still glanced at corners sometimes. Habits like that don't vanish overnight. But now there was something else there too. Direction. Frank Miller raised the flag outside his house for the first time in years. The fabric was faded and stitched where time had worried it thin, but it climbed the pole without apology, snapping once in the breeze. Frank stood beneath it, back straight despite the ache, eyes wet but unblinking. Neighbors paused as they passed, some saluting, some simply stopping to look. It wasn't a ceremony. It was a reminder that endurance, when given room, becomes dignity again. Ethan came to the diner early on his last morning. He took a small table this time, sunlight warming the wood, shadow settling at his feet with the ease of a job completed. Mary brought breakfast without asking. Eggs done right, toast buttered generously. For Shadow, she placed a plate on the floor with 2 sausages. On the house, she said, daring anyone to argue. Shadow waited for Ethan's nod, then accepted the gift with quiet enthusiasm, tail thumping once against the chair leg. When Ethan paid, Mary tried to refuse. He closed her fingers gently around the bill and shook his head. "For the next kid," he said. She nodded, blinking fast, and pressed her hand to her mouth. Outside, the street had gathered without planning it, people standing along the sidewalk, hats in hands, hands in pockets, eyes steady. No cheers, no speeches, just presence. Frank stepped forward, cane tucked under his arm, and raised a crisp salute that held more history than words ever could. Ethan returned it, remembered and precise, then climbed into his truck. Shadow hopped up beside him, nose already searching the air ahead. As the engine turned over, the town didn't follow. It didn't need to. Pine Ridge had found its footing again. Ethan drove out beneath the open sky, leaving behind a place that no longer needed him. The light stayed. The town kept it. Sometimes miracles don't come from the sky. They come through people who choose to do what's right, quietly, bravely, and at the right moment. God doesn't always act instead of us. Sometimes He works through us. If this story touched your heart, may God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps in everyday life. May the Lord watch over you and bring light back to every dark place. If you believe in quiet miracles, share this story, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel so we can keep sharing stories of faith, hope, and healing. God bless you.